Hello everyone, and welcome back to Conspiraseed. This week, as I'm sure you could tell by the title, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I don't have a script for this one, it's all going to be off the cuff. I'm going to be doing a book review of The Black Farm by Elias Withrow. I don't want to give spoilers without a spoiler warning, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read the back of the book for you. Just, the back page. And I'm going to kind of give you like a gore warning, and then if this is a book you'd rather read than watch my review for, feel free to click off the video afterwards, go ahead, read it for yourself, come back. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the review of The Black Farm. I'm just trying something a little bit different. It is still within like the same genre, like the book is a horror book, so I think it kind of works well with the channel. Yeah, thank you for choosing to spend some time with me today, and let's just get into it. Alright, so the back of the book reads, after the loss of a child, along with a slew of agonizing misfortunes, Nick and Jess decide to end their lives. Unable to cope with the misery that fills their days, they commit one last act together and die in loving relief. But when Nick wakes up, he soon realizes that death isn't the gentle darkness he expected. Panicked and horrified, he struggles to understand the twisted abominations and hellish world he's now trapped in. Driven by despair and a sudden will to survive, he sets out to find Jess and is unable to cope with the thought of her having to suffer through the terrors of this new reality. But nothing could prepare him for the nightmares he found. Nothing could prepare him for the Black Farm. It is a very, shock and awe book. It is gory for the sake of being gory. I'm the only person that I know that's read it. My mom asked to borrow it and got to chapter 4 and didn't read anymore and gave it back to me. So I do have to let you know, it is like a very gory book. It's like gory for the sake of being gory. It's literally just like for the shock value. But in my mind, it kind of sounded like Outlast 2, and I thought that game was really interesting, so I picked it up and I read it, and I thought it was really like a really interesting read. There were times that I wish I could have put this book down, right? Like it had a grip on me, and I was like, I read something and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to read that. I want to put this book down, but I couldn't put the book down. It was just, I don't know how to explain it other than that. It was a very good book. So let's get into kind of the synopsis and review. Yeah, so right before the book starts, it says, one last thing, this book is not for the faint of heart. I don't know. I don't think it focused on it, but one last thing, the story is not for the faint of heart. As the book mentioned, the main character is a guy named Nick. Him and his girlfriend Jess both decide to commit unalive together. They've had a slew of family deaths. Nick got laid off from his job, so they have no way of paying the mortgage on their new house. And then Jess has a miscarriage. It's all too much for specifically Jess to bear, and she decides that she wants to no longer be alive. Nick says that he'll go out with her, so they get a bunch of medication, put it on their table, take it together. He holds her as they fall into death. What he's not expecting, however, of course, is the Black Farm. He mentions multiple times at the beginning of the book that death is just going to be something really easy, right? Like you just die and there's nothing afterwards. So when he wakes up with rain splattering onto his face, he's understandably confused. He can feel himself being dragged through what he thinks is mud, and when he eventually does get his eyes opened, he sees a horribly disformed person-looking thing dragging him from a chain to a barn. Once he makes it into the barn, the human-looking disfigured thing chains him up by his arms to the ceiling and leaves. Eventually, this guy named Danny comes in and he says, you're at the Black Farm. He explains what the Black Farm is. He explains the options that you have. So once you get to the Black Farm, you have two options. You can choose to stay at the Black Farm and you're just there forever, right? Because death is eternal. You're there forever. Or there's a god of the world called the pig, and you can choose to feed the pig instead of spend your life on the Black Farm. Should you choose to feed the pig, you go to the pig, he eats you, and if you taste good, he will send you back to your body on Earth. If you taste bad, he sends you to hell, which according to Danny is only a little bit worse. In my opinion, I think that is probably the best option, would be to feed the pig if you're in this situation. Now, what is the Black Farm? Danny goes on to explain to Nick that the Black Farm is where all the suicidals go. That's what they're called. Anyone who's off themselves ends up on the Black Farm, and they're called suicidals. For part of the book, you do, if you know anything about religion, you do kind of have to suspend your belief, as he explains that the reason that the Black Farm exists is because Satan and God kept arguing about where people who off themselves should go. God didn't think it was fair that one mistake should send people to hell, and then Satan said, well, they're still killing someone, so they shouldn't go to heaven. So they made the Black Farm and put this being called the pig in charge. That's when you learn that the creature that brought Nick to the barn is something called Pigborn. The pig tried to make his own form of life, and he's just not as powerful as God is, so his form of life is deeply deranged and deeply misfigured and gross and just disgusting looking. Nick says that he's not going to feed the pig. He's going to take his chances out in the Black Farm because he believes that his girlfriend would have done the same thing, and so he wants to go find her. Danny says, all right, well, best of luck to you, and sends him out on his way. Upon leaving the barn, Nick sees a tree line of what he assumes is a forest, and he decides that that's the safest place to be because it provides cover as opposed to being out in the open where he could just be seen by anyone or anything. He makes his way to the tree line, and there he actually meets a girl named Megan. Megan actually runs into him as he's leaving the tree line for the first time because he sees what he thinks is a beach and ocean. He starts heading out there and he hears a woman yell stop. He doesn't stop, of course, he just blows past the woman, and then he eventually comes to a halt because he looks up and he sees these stone monster things walking back and forth in the ocean. He goes back to the woman and he says, what are those? And she mentions that there's something called keepers. The Black Farm is an island, and so to keep people from escaping, they have keepers in the water that patrol the ocean at all times to make sure that no one can leave. If they feel movement within the ocean, they beeline towards that movement, and instead of killing them, they have a giant cross as a head, and they will hang the person from their cross. And that person will never die to be reborn into the Black Farm. They are just there for all eternity, being tortured, essentially, being hung by their arms, just forever and ever. Megan eventually talks him back into coming back into the tree line, and they start talking, and she explains that she's been there for a while. She explains to Nick how the Black Farm works, what the Pigborn are, and how if you die in the Black Farm, you are just reborn into the Black Farm. He looks up into the sky, and he sees slits of red. Within those slits of red are drops, almost like blood, coming out, but with people in them. These are people either being born into the Black Farm for the first time, or people that have died being reborn. She explains that the Pigborn are essentially there to torture the people and to make their lives miserable. You do feel pain at the Black Farm. Anything that happens to you, you can feel. The pig tried to make a sun, similar to the sun that we have for Earth, but again, he's not as powerful as God. So it's a black hole in the sky that emanates some light, but very little. It's almost like perpetual nighttime with a full moon, and it's always raining. The rain, of course, adds to the terror, as there's no place to get dry. I don't know if you've ever been out in the rain, but after an hour of just being in pounding rain, it's like, it's one of the worst things. I hate it. Megan explains that the pig lives in a place called the barn, and he's the one that made all the creatures that roam the island that torture all the suicidals. She mentions that the worst among the Pigborn is a Pigborn named Muck. She says that Muck is notorious for torturing people just to the brink of death, but not quite killing them so that they can't be reborn. Megan tells Nick about the layout of the island. There's a mountain, which of course Nick has already noticed. Nick asks her about two lights that he's seen up top. He's seen a blue light and a red light, and he asks her about those, and she mentions something called the Eye of the World, but refuses to elaborate further, saying it's not any of their concern or business. He asks if anyone's ever been up there, and she just laughs him off and says no. She then mentions that at the base of the mountain there is a temple that belongs to a religion called the Hooves. The Hooves believe that the pig is perfect and want to embody him in every way. They want to make human and pig-born hybrids because they think that pig-born are the ultimate people, and if they can mate a human with a pig-born, then it will be the ultimate creation. Then, of course, there's the forest that they're in, and then there is a little area that belongs to the pig-born muck, which I mentioned earlier. It's called the needle fields. It's a bunch of needles that stick out of the ground, and he'll eventually stick you on one of the needles and you'll bleed out, but it takes a couple of days and it's just an agonizing way to go. Then there's the barn, and the barn is where the pig lives. You basically just want to stay clear of that side of the forest. You don't want to go near the needle fields at all, and you don't want to get near the barn because a lot of pig-born are near the barn, and then muck of the needle fields, of course, is the worst pig-born of all. Now, there aren't just pig-born to deal with here in this world of the Black Farm. There's also other suicidals who will do anything they can to survive, including work with some of the pig-born if they have to. So Nick and Megan get into a fight with another group, and they're both knocked out. When they come to, they're in a cave. Megan's chained to a wall and Nick's in a cage. That's when they see Muck. It's Muck's cave. Muck walks in and immediately starts torturing Megan. Nick tells him to stop, and he comes over and he tells Nick to shut up. Then he pulls Nick out of his cage and he sits him in front of Megan and he says, "Watch. You have to watch this." Nick says no and he closes his eyes. Muck says, "You have to watch." Nick, of course, again says no. Muck leaves, comes back with a knife and cuts Nick's eyelids off so that he has no choice but to watch. The searing pain from having his eyelids cut off causes him to faint. When he comes to again, he is back in his cage and Megan is gone. Muck comes back with a piece of hard bread and he says, "It's for you to eat." Nick says, "I can't eat this, it's too hard." Muck says, "Okay, well, we'll fix that." What Muck does is he goes to his workbench, he comes back with a pair of pliers. He pulls out all of Nick's teeth and replaces them with screws, saying, "There, now your teeth are sharper, you should be able to eat this." Nick starts punching at the cage, which Muck sees as a challenge, and he cuts his arms off. Muck then wraps barbed wire around both of his bare legs and pulls him out of the cage. He takes Nick to the original barn where Nick was first met with Danny and explained what the Black Farm kind of was, and given the choice to feed the pig. When he's there, Muck makes him take a bite with his screw teeth out of a person who has just entered the Black Farm. Funnily enough, actually, there's like a pre-Black Farm almost on Reddit, on the No Sleep subreddit by Elias Withrow, the same dude, and the guy that Nick takes a bite out of is the same guy that story centers around. It's just a short story, maybe a 5-minute read, but it centers around that guy. So Nick is being dragged by Muck, and they're headed towards the needle fields, and Nick is like, "I've had too much of this, I need to die," but Muck won't let him. So while he's being dragged, Nick turns around so that his belly is on the ground, and he opens his mouth, and what it does is it takes a bunch of the dirt that's on the ground, the mud, because it's always raining, it lodges itself in his screw teeth, it creates a ball of screws and mud that he swallows, which restricts his airways, cuts open his throat, and then he dies and is reborn. Once he's reborn, he kind of walks around the forest for a little bit, and then he sees what looks like a small town near a beach. He heads over there and he meets two people who say that they're working on a boat to escape, and they're pretty sure that they can make it past the keepers. They've been watching the keepers walk back and forth throughout the ocean, and they determined that there is about a 6-hour window where there's no keepers right in this one section of ocean, and so they should be able to slowly row through it without causing too much of a disturbance. He says that he would love to go with them, but he's not going without his girlfriend, Jess. As he turns to leave and go find his girlfriend, Jess, he sees the lights on the mountain once again, and he asks the two about it. They again mention the eyes of the world, but say no one's ever been up there and to not talk about it. They convince him to stay for a little bit to rest and eat some food, where they tell him more about the Hooves, the religion that believes that the pig is the ultimate god. They explain that they take women and force them to breed with pig-born, and so that's probably where his girlfriend is if she's didn't choose to feed the pig. If she's on the Black Farm, she's probably with the Hooves. So he goes to rescue Jess under the guise of joining their religion. He shows up and he meets one of the high priests of the religion, and he says that he's interested in joining. And the high priest is basically like, "Oh, well, you're just in time because we're going to take the new recruits over to meet the pig himself and pledge loyalty to the pig to show that you are part of this religion and this is something that you want to do." Nick's like, "Awesome, great." The fastest way is through the forest, even though it's safer for the group to stay out in the open because the Pigborn do not attack the religion of the Hooves because they're told not to. The fastest way is through the forest, so they go through the forest instead. There they're attacked by a group of suicidals, and one of the new members dies. All that's left is Nick, one of the new members, and the high priest. Eventually they go talk to the pig, everything goes great, and they leave. When they get back, Nick hears something coming from the basement of the temple. He goes down there and he sees that what's going on is they are currently forcing someone to mate with a Pigborn to try to make a Pigborn human hybrid. He looks on the table and lo and behold, it's Megan, who he saw earlier in the forest, Small World. However, along the wall is lined up a number of girls who are being forced to wait their turn, and there he sees Jess, his girlfriend. Thinking on his toes, he grabs a torch and runs upstairs to his room, where he lights his room on fire. He runs out and he goes, there's a fire, and everyone runs towards the fire to try to put it out, and he runs downstairs saying there's a fire, and everyone runs upstairs, leaving all the women alone. He grabs Jess and he says, let's go. As they're leaving, he sees the high priest on his way up the stairs, and he says, I knew there was something about you. I knew that you weren't here for the actual religion itself. They fight, Nick kills him, and they leave. It's a close call as they're both tired, and both the Hooves and the Pigborn are now chasing Jess and Nick. But they do eventually make it back to the forest, and then they eventually make it back to the town with the two men who are making a raft. The men are like, perfect, you guys are just in time, we're about to head out. Nick's like, great. So they all get on the raft and they head out into the ocean. At this point, they're like, we have to be very, very quiet. So they're just rowing silently, and it's getting darker and darker as they go because there's no torches or anything from the temple, and there's just the light of this fake sun along with the rain. It's getting darker as they go, and they're getting farther away from the sun, so there's less sunlight. They take turns with 2 people rowing and 2 people sleeping. Eventually it's Nick's turn to sleep, and he's like, please just don't let me wake up back on the Black Farm. I don't want to die in my sleep and be reborn. Eventually he's nudged awake, and they're like, Nick, you have to look at this. He looks over the side of the boat, and underneath the boat is the ocean, and it's glowing. And they see another keeper at the bottom of the ocean who is essentially being born. He's just laying down there, and he's essentially in the process of being born. They're like, we have to be super quiet because we're right on top of this guy. So they row quieter. They don't talk at all. They don't eat. They barely breathe. And eventually they're out. They do eventually see a ray of light, like actual sunshine light, in the middle of the ocean. And they're like, that's perfect. That's where we need to go. They start headed towards there when all of a sudden these things pop out of the water and start screaming, which alert all the keepers. Since being got by a keeper doesn't kill you to be reborn, it's just eternal torture. They have a knife on board just in case. Nick takes the knife, he stabs his girlfriend Jess so that she can be reborn on the Black Farm. He says, I'll find you again, and then he stabs himself and is reborn. This time he says, I've had enough. I'm going to the top of the mountain and I'm going to see what the eyes of the world are. Once he gets to the base of the mountain, he meets a man named Pudge. Pudge is your typical fat redneck, right? Wearing overalls with nothing underneath, and he made himself a shotgun with the stuff that he found on the farm. At this point, Pudge isn't in a heavily pig-born area, so he hunts them for fun. That's how he spends his time. Instead of hiding from them, he hunts them. He says he'll go along with Nick to the top of the mountain. It's quite a hike. They run out of breath multiple times. They wait. And eventually, Nick says, let me see your gun. I'm going to go ahead. And Pudge is very reluctant, of course, because he made the gun. Nick might kill him with it. His instincts are correct. When Nick wrestles the gun away from him, he shoots Pudge in the chest. Pudge dies, and Nick continues on. Once Nick reaches the top of the mountain, he sees 2 men, one glowing red and one glowing blue. He asks who they are, and they're both angels. One that's glowing red is from hell, and one that's glowing blue is from heaven. They're both sent from their respective areas, both heaven and hell, to keep an eye on the Black Farm to make sure the pig doesn't get too out of hand. Obviously, everything's going wrong on the Black Farm, so get too out of hand just means make sure that the pig doesn't try to leave the domain. They say that the lights that he sees are them sending reports back to their respective leaders, either Satan or God. The red light is the hell angel sending a report back to Satan, and the blue light is the heaven angel sending a report back to God about the ongoings of the Black Farm. Nick, of course, is super upset about this, and he says, what kind of god would do this? And they take him back to their cabin that is on top of the mountain. They're talking, they're letting Nick ask questions about the Black Farm and heaven and hell, when Nick stands up with the shotgun and hits the back of the head of the Hell's Angel. He then points the shotgun at the Blue Angel and he says, you're not going anywhere. He ties up the Red Angel, shoots the Blue Angel, eats the Blue Angel, shoots the Red Angel, goes back down the mountain to find his girlfriend. His thinking is, if he is pure enough because he ate a heavenly angel, then he will force the pig to eat him, and because he is pure, he will be sent back to his body on Earth. He gets down to the bottom of the mountain, he makes his way straight for the barn. Once he gets to the barn, there is an army of pigborn waiting outside. Danny, from the beginning of the book, walks out and he says, Nick, what are you doing here? You've ruined everything. Nick says, what do you mean I've ruined everything? Danny says, turn around. Nick turns around, the black sun has blown up, and there are streaks of red and blue in the sky, which are both red angels and blue angels coming down to the Black Farm, because the ones that were already there were killed and they're coming down for revenge. Nick says, listen, I just want to feed the pig. I just want to feed the pig. He's like, I'm not feeding the pig without my girlfriend. Find my girlfriend and let me feed the pig. Danny says, well, you're in luck. We already have Jess. She's already here. Her and Nick embrace, and Nick forces some of the angel into her mouth and forces her to swallow it, saying, this is for your own good, trust me. They then climb into the mouth of the pig, who chews them, swallows them, and starts convulsing. He tries to push them out of his mouth because obviously Nick is too pure. With the angel being inside him, Nick is too pure, and it is burning the pig, who is evil. Nick grabs Jess, and he says, Jess, keep crawling, we just have to get down his throat. They force themselves down his throat, and then they wake up in each other's arms, back in their house. They're both relieved, and are like, wow, I can't believe that's what happens if you commit self-death. I don't know if that review did it justice. I thought the book was pretty good, personally. Like I said, it's really gory, and it's gory for the sake of being gory. Like, it's literally just for shock value. It doesn't add anything to the book. There are a couple times where Nick's inner dialogue takes me out of the story. If I had to give it a rating out of 5 stars, I'd probably give it 4.5. As I had mentioned, there were times that I wish I could have put the book down, right? There are times, like when he's in Muck's cage, that I was like, I don't want to read about what happens to Nick, but I need to know what happens to him later. And I was like, I wish I could put the book down kind of scenario. It's the times that you can put the book down are during Nick's monologues or like dialogues. Like, he has an inner dialogue with himself, and it's just kind of poorly written sometimes, where his inner monologue is different from the rest of the book, and it kind of pulls you away from the story itself. Overall, I liked the book a lot. I thought it was a good read. There's a sequel that I'm almost done with, and if this goes over well, I might do a book review on the sequel as well. But I did enjoy the book a lot. The Black Farm by Elias Withrow. I do think that if you can get past the gore of reading it, it's a good read. And it is something that, you know, if you're just looking for a horror book to read, I do recommend reading it. I actually found this from an Instagram reel. Someone was books that scared them versus books that scarred them. And this was one of the books that scarred them. It is actually kind of an interesting read because, so I have anxiety and depression. And anytime I'm like, man, you know, I don't really want to be alive anymore. I'm like, you could be on the Black Farm. And I'm like, oh, you're right. And then I don't feel that way. So it is a good read if you feel that way. So I do highly recommend it. If you can get past the gore, I think it's a pretty good read. That was, like I said, something a little bit different. It was a book review. I haven't done a book review before on the channel. I was thinking about doing like a special video on like the first Sunday of each month, breaking down a chapter of the Bible, because the Bible is just kind of like a history book and it has like some cool lore in it. So if you liked this, let me know what you think about that idea in the comments down below. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with me today. I know this is something a little different, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.